RUSI New South Wales is an independent, apolitical, not-for-profit public education institute that, since 1888, has been promoting informed debate on and enhancing public awareness and understanding of defence and national security issues. We are Australia's oldest think tank. We conduct monthly lectures and seminars, issue a monthly newsletter, provide research support through our extensive military and historical library located in the Anzac Memorial in Sydney's Hyde Park, and together with RUSI Australia, publish a national quarterly magazine called United Service, with informed articles addressing the latest defence and security issues.
Please note, this monthly update presents the geostrategic situation as at the 9th of August 2025. As often with these rapidly changing events, the monthly update can be out of date by the time it is published. Russo-Ukrainian War by David Lease. There is still no end in sight to the Russo-Ukrainian War. Ukraine, having been invaded by Russia in 2014 and again in 2022, is unwilling to cede any of its sovereign territory to Russia, whereas Russia is demanding a resolution of the underlying issues that it says led to the war in the first place, namely NATO's eastward expansion towards and up to the international borders of the Russian Federation and, to this end, seeks Ukraine's capitulation. The United States is the key to resolving the issue, as it is the only nation with the military resources of weapons, ammunition, and other war material to keep Ukraine in the war. Ukraine's European allies, while promising support, lack the military-industrial capacity to sustain the fighting which has been ongoing at various levels of intensity for over 11 years. With wavering among some NATO members, Britain and France are seeking to develop a coalition of the willing to support Ukraine, but the coalition is slow in getting underway. Now halfway through the fourth year of continuous heavy fighting since the 2022 invasion, Ukraine is struggling with recruiting frontline fighters and sustaining the levels of artillery, air defense, and small arms ammunition needed at current rates of usage. This is despite its cutting-edge scientific and technological innovation and manufacture of missiles and drones, of which it is now a world leader. Russia itself and Russian oligarchs, however, have suffered under Western sanctions imposed since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The Russian economy has been forced onto a war footing, and action is on foot in the West to sell some of the Russian assets seized and frozen in Europe, and the United States to help pay for assistance being provided to Ukraine. China and India, in particular, though, are supporting the Russian economy by purchasing Russian oil and other goods. Against this background, and increasingly frustrated by President Vladimir Putin's intransigence, President Donald Trump warned Putin in late July that, if Russia did not agree to plans for a ceasefire by the 8th of August, Trump would impose high tariffs on countries breaking the Western trade embargo on Russia. When Trump had not received a satisfactory response from Putin by his deadline, Trump imposed a 25% tariff to begin on the 27th of August on Indian goods sold to the United States on top of a 25% tariff already in place. A similar additional tariff, however, was not placed on China. It was announced on the 9th of August that President Putin and President Trump would meet in Alaska on the 15th of August to discuss options for long-term peace in Ukraine. Whether or not President Volodymyr Zelensky will also be invited is not known yet. Irrespective of whether Zelensky attends, however, Western analysts are pessimistic as to chances of a favorable outcome to these talks. It seems that a deal under consideration involves an exchange of territory now occupied by opposing military forces. One proposal involves Ukraine making major territorial concessions, including the handover of the entire Donbass as well as Crimea to Russia, along with the freezing of the remainder of the front line. It is difficult to see Ukraine or its European allies agreeing to this. Hence, it is difficult to avoid the impression that Putin is using peace talks as a ploy to avoid new US sanctions and, by offering peace terms known to be unacceptable to Ukraine, to avoid meaningful ceasefire negotiations while continuing the war. Turning now to the fighting itself, Russia continues to hold the upper hand in the war on land, but its spring, summer offensive is making slow progress. Ukraine continues to hold the upper hand in the war at sea, but with the Western Black Sea essentially a Ukrainian lake and Ukraine sea lines of communication open to mercantile trade, especially the vital grain exports, Ukraine is not pushing further east. Hence, with slow progress on land and a stalemate at sea, both sides are placing increased emphasis on missile and drone attacks on the opponent's cities and strategic infrastructure. Since early May, Russia has substantially increased the tempo of its now nightly drone and missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, and the tempo has increased further in July and early August. Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, are bearing the brunt of Putin's displeasure that Ukraine is still defending its territory and in retaliation for Ukraine's successful drone and missile attacks on Russia, especially its airfields. Part of the reason for the slow progress of Russia's ground offensive is that all along the 1,200 kilometers front line, Ukraine has established close drone surveillance to a depth of 15 kilometers, enabling artillery and drone strikes on advancing Russian forces, whether in small groups or larger formations. Russian progress is largely dependent on electronic jamming of the Ukrainian drones. Ukraine's 7-month cross-border incursion from its Sumy Oblast into Russia's Kursk Oblast, which began on the 6th of August 2024 and at its peak had seized over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory, had ended by the 16th of March 2025. The last Ukrainian forces withdrew from Kursk Oblast to new defensive positions along the Sumy-Kursk border. Since then, there has been continuing skirmishing along the border. Ukrainian forces also invaded Belgorod Oblast in March-April and now hold some isolated pockets along the international border, but Ukraine now will be unable to use its occupation of significant Russian territory as a bargaining chip in any peace negotiations. As to the fighting along the 1,000 kilometers front line in eastern and southern Ukraine, by early June, Russia's spring-summer offensive had made some progress. Each side was making marginal tactical gains at various places, but overall, the Russians had the better of the fighting and were expanding the amount of territory they control. On the eastern axis, Russia has been seeking to capture all of the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, Ukraine's industrial heartland. Luhansk Oblast is now largely in Russian hands. In Donetsk Oblast, Russian forces have been advancing slowly westwards towards the strategic city of Pokrovsk and to the south of the city towards Donetsk's border with Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. On the 8th of June, Russian forces reached the Dnipropetrovsk border in southern Donetsk, but key parts of western and central Donetsk remain in Ukrainian hands. Importantly, these include the so-called Donetsk fortress belt of cities and towns north of Pokrovsk, which runs in a 50 kilometers north-south line along the H20 Kostiantynivka-Sloviansk highway. Analysts suggest that to seize the fortress belt could take the Russians several years. On the 1st of August, Russian forces captured Chasiv Yar, a key city in central Donetsk, after 16 months of fighting. Russian pressure will now build further on Pokrovsk. While Russian forces had closed up to Pokrovsk from the south several months ago, there has been a tactical stalemate around the city which is not cut off and remains in Ukrainian hands. For months, Ukrainian forces have picked off Russian soldiers by the thousand around Pokrovsk using small drones armed with bombs to tie down a numerically superior force. Now, though, Russian troops are creeping forward probing for weak spots in Ukraine's defenses, and in late July some Russian soldiers entered Pokrovsk for the first time. Given Russia's primary focus is in the Donbass, it is concentrated mainly on consolidating its earlier gains on the southern axis. Russian forces have sought to maintain their frontline positions in Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, with their main southern axis offensive operations continuing to be in western Zaporizhia, where they continue to assault using small infantry groups together with motorcycle teams. Here they employ a wave tactic, sending 4 to 5 motorcycles to find gaps in Ukrainian defenses and then follow up with dismounted infantry to consolidate positions. Russia now holds some 3/4 of Zaporizhia, and Ukrainian military analysts estimate that the Russians have accumulated as many as 70,000 troops along the Zaporizhia front, plus hundreds of tanks and artillery. In summary, on the eastern axis, the Russian advance to Pokrovsk and south of it to the Dnipropetrovsk border is the most notable change in control of the front line for several months. But analysts say innovative tactics by Ukrainian forces, combining the use of drones and ground forces, have inflicted significant losses on Russian forces and slowed their offensive. On the southern axis, there is a stalemate as in the war at sea. Israel-Gaza War by David Leese. In potentially a major escalation of the war and against the advice of the Chief of the General Staff of the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, General Eyal Zamir, on the 7th of August the Israeli Security Cabinet approved a plan for the IDF to take over and occupy Gaza City. Reports are confusing, but it seems Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had wanted approval for the IDF to occupy the whole Gaza Strip. It already occupies some 75% of the Strip, with a view to eliminating the remaining pockets of Hamas guerrillas and to freeing the remaining hostages. After Hamas was eliminated, the enclave would be handed over to Arab forces to govern. According to Netanyahu's office, the IDF now will take over Gaza City while providing humanitarian aid to the civilian population outside the combat zones. Netanyahu's office also outlined its 5 steps towards ending the war, including disarmament of Hamas, return of all hostages, both living and dead, demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, Israel to exercise security control over the Gaza Strip, and the existence of an alternative civilian government that is not Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. The statement added that an absolute majority of cabinet ministers believe that the alternative plan presented to the cabinet would not achieve the defeat of Hamas or the return of the abductees. It is not clear yet how this cabinet decision will be implemented. Early indications are that the civilian population will be moved to new resettlement camps outside the city or further south with a view to separating the civilians from the Hamas fighters and other Palestinian militia, before the IDF begins systematic clearance of the city. This decision has been taken against a background of a humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip where the guerrilla war between the IDF and Hamas continues, a breakdown in peace negotiations between the warring parties, majority opposition in Israel to the continuation of the war, and overwhelming opposition internationally to the war continuing. General Eyal Zamir is reported to have told the Security Cabinet that the full occupation of Gaza was tantamount to walking into a trap. The offensive would endanger the lives of the remaining hostages, as well as the lives of soldiers exhausted by repeated deployments to Gaza. As to the humanitarian crisis, the Gaza administration reports that more than 60,000 Palestinians have been killed since the war began 22 months ago. These figures include some 200 civilians who have died of starvation over the last couple of months. With the IDF employing airstrikes, artillery, and tanks in fighting the guerrillas in densely populated built-up areas, inevitably vital infrastructure has been destroyed and civilian casualties have been high. This has put the remaining medical supplies and facilities under great strain. Further, the heavy restrictions which the IDF has placed on entry to and distribution of food and water within the Gaza Strip have led to famine conditions in much of the enclave. Masses of starving civilians queuing at food distribution points have been fired on by IDF troops apparently fearing for their own safety. This has been compounded, among other things, by Israel using Bedouin tribal militia to protect food convoys from looting only for some Bedouins to use the opportunity for their own benefit. Attempts over the last 2 to 3 weeks by the IDF and some neighboring states to relieve the hunger crisis by airdrops and an increase in road resupply convoys have helped relieve the situation somewhat, but not at the scale required. Massive road resupply convoys, 500 aid trucks per day, are needed to solve these logistics problems. Peace negotiations between Hamas and Israel brokered by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States broke down again in early August. A United States plan for a temporary 60-day ceasefire was rejected. The plan would have provided for the relief of the humanitarian crisis in the enclave, accompanied by the release some more of the 50 Israeli hostages, 20 of whom are believed to be alive but starving, still held by Hamas in exchange for some additional Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Under strong pressure from Arab states, however, Hamas did give some ground, agreeing to eventually disarm, but not before an independent Palestinian state had been established with its capital in Jerusalem. This was not acceptable to Israel, which insisted on the immediate disarmament of Hamas and the release of all hostages. Political opinion in Israel is now divided. Recent opinion surveys indicate that there is strong majority support for ending the war immediately and negotiating the return of all remaining hostages. Large public demonstrations to this end, some led by the families of hostages, are a regular occurrence in major Israeli cities. The military advice to the Israeli government is that the war's military objectives have been achieved. Further military pressure will not bring back the hostages, nor defeat Hamas or make it give up its weapons. Further, a crisis of trust is developing between the government and the military, and there is increasing reluctance among military reservists to respond to call-up notices, some choosing jail in preference. Nevertheless, there remains strong support for continuation of the war in some quarters, especially among ultra-Orthodox Jews, settler groups, and right-wing politicians. The Security Cabinet decision of the 7th of August reflects this latter view. The international community was largely supportive of Israel acting to defend itself following the surprise attack on southern Israel on the 7th of October 2023 by Hamas-led militants, in which 1195 Israelis and foreign nationals, including 815 civilians, were killed and 251 taken hostage. As the war has progressed, however, the international support for Israel has slowly weakened, increasingly so as the civilian death toll in Gaza has mounted and the humanitarian crisis has unfolded. Israel now has few supporters and remains in the war only with the diplomatic and military logistic support of the United States. Indeed, since February, France, as leader of a European bloc, including the European Union, and Saudi Arabia, as leader of an Arab bloc, including the Arab League, have been working behind the scenes to create preconditions for negotiations towards a two-state solution. For their part, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab League now support the two-state solution as originally envisaged by the United Nations when Israel was formed. They favor a Palestinian state with its capital in Jerusalem governed by a reformed Palestinian Authority. To this end, all 22 countries in the Arab League now have condemned the Hamas attack on Israel of the 7th of October 2023, demanded that Hamas disarm, and insisted that Hamas relinquish control of Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. For its part, the Palestinian Authority has agreed to conduct democratic elections in 2026, with a view to a leadership transition to a younger generation. The Franco-Saudi-led group is also proposing a temporary stabilization mission for Gaza. Crucially, some of the countries have offered to supply troops to such a mission. That said, I suspect that it would be a great struggle to put such a mission together and sustain it. Over the past month, images of starving children, beamed around the world, have led some of Israel's stanchest friends to urge the immediate cessation of hostilities and hostage return. On the 9th of August, Germany, which provides 30% of Israel's armaments, suspended the export to Israel of armaments for use in Gaza. France announced on the 24th of July that it will vote for the recognition of Palestine as a nation-state at the United Nations General Assembly meeting in late September, and the United Kingdom and Canada have announced that they, subject to certain conditions, will follow suit. Australia may well join them. The ultimate success of these diplomatic moves may devolve on the achievement or otherwise of United States concurrence. Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea by David Deasy. As the July podcast was being put to bed, the Houthis captured and sank 2 internationally flagged merchant ships in the lower Red Sea off the coast of Yemen. The first attack occurred the 6th of July, approximately 51 nautical miles from the coast of Yemen. This attack was carried out by high-speed boats described as skiffs equipped with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, as well as 4 uncrewed surface vessels, USVs, which are sea drones. These drone craft are about 7 meters in length and are packed with explosives. The target was a Liberian-flagged bulk carrier, the MV Magic Seas, which was struck on the side by 2 drones causing damage. The crew was captured and the boat sank. The MV Magic Seas had been transporting a cargo of fertilizer and iron from China to Turkey. The Houthis claimed that interests or ships belonging to the co-management company, All Seas Marine, had visited Israel. The second attack occurred less than 24 hours later, on the 7th of July, when a Liberian-flagged bulk carrier, the MV Eternity Sea, was attacked, slightly to the south and closer to Yemen than the first attack. Again, the operation involved high-speed skiffs using automatic weapons, RPGs, and USVs, so it is reasonable to presume that it was the same combat group as carried out the first attack. This time, 4 Filipino seamen were killed and several other crewmen were injured. Again, it is not clear whether they were resisting, and it seems likely that they were killed in the initial RPG fire. While some of the crew were rescued by passing merchantmen, 10 were taken hostage. The irony is that the Eternity Sea had just completed a humanitarian delivery to Somalia and was on its way to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to refuel. A Houthi spokesman claimed 5 ballistic and cruise missiles had been used. If so, they do not seem to have hit their targets, as there are no eyewitness accounts of missiles hitting the ships. It seems more likely that the claim was propaganda or disinformation, or they had been used later to sink the vessels, although again evidence seems to say that explosives were placed on board. These 2 attacks, which so far have not been repeated, represented a sudden uptick in operations, as the most recent prior attack was the 26th of December 2024. France's Maritime Information Cooperation and Awareness Centre, MICA, in Brest, maintains that these events are not a change in trend, as both ships had connections in some way with Israel, as they had either made stopovers in Israel or other ships or executives belonging to their company had visited. It speculated that the Houthis were trying to put pressure on the then ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and Israel. On the evidence, these attacks were pirate operations, not shore-based missile or drone strikes. A significant technological aspect of the strikes was the use of explosive USVs. Assuming a reasonable level of remote control, it shows yet a further growth in technology by the Houthi forces. The taking of hostages also seems to be an essential part of the operation, as in the past they have not only been held against a stated political objective being achieved, but have been forced to broadcast criticism of their company's involvement with Israel. On the 28th of July, the Houthis released a video in which the hostages speak about the decision to travel through the Red Sea. The video also shows the Houthis treating wounds of the abducted mariners and the mariners speaking with their families. The Houthis are using the video to bolster their claim that Eternity Sea was a legitimate target because it was linked to Israeli ports. All good propaganda. Expert views on the attack's significance are all similar. Mohammed al-Bashar, a Yemen expert who writes the risk analysis, the Bosher Report, wrote, "Whether the Houthi action was coordinated with Tehran or initiated independently, the message is clear. They possess both the capability and the political will to disrupt, and they are carefully choosing when to act." While Nadwa Dorsari, an associate fellow with the Middle East Institute, wrote, "For the Houthis, this is bigger than Gaza. These strikes boost their regional standing, fuel their narrative, and advance their goal of becoming the new leader of the axis of resistance, all while reinforcing Iran's broader regional agenda. I've warned before, the Houthis aren't just disrupting shipping. They're taking hostages and weaponizing them for leverage." The Times of India, citing British Maritime Agency, AMBRI, reported yet a third attack on a merchant vessel, this time on the 24th of July 2025. This attack was staged on a Comoros-registered livestock vessel some 30 nautical miles off the Yemeni port of Mocha, as it was transiting the Red Sea, northbound. This attack was carried out by a single wooden boat, the occupants armed with automatic weapons. The attack failed, and it was neither claimed by the Houthis nor does it fit their current operating pattern. so it looks very much like a local act of piracy. 80% of Houthi attacks on shipping have been mounted either in the Red Sea or the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, as this area is closer to Houthi strongholds, with only 20% in the Gulf of Aden, which requires longer transits by Houthi forces. However, if as mentioned last month, the Houthis gain a significant foothold in Somalia or a controlling alliance with al-Shabaab or other Somali rebel groups, it would open greater options for them in the Gulf of Aden. As of the 7th of August, there were no United States warships in the Red Sea or Gulf of Aden. Cambodia-Thailand border conflict by David Leese. In late July, a 4-day war broke out between Cambodia and Thailand along their shared border. The origins of disagreement between Cambodia and Thailand about the alignment of their shared border, however, date back over a century to French colonial days and specifically to the Franco-Siamese Border Treaty of 1904 and an associated 1907 French map delimiting the border. Since Cambodian independence from France in 1952, there have been many border disputes between Cambodia and Thailand, generally centered on important Hindu temples claimed by communities on both sides of the border, a notable case in point being the Temple of Priya Vihir, which is located in the Dangrik Mountains, which form a natural boundary between the two nations at the eastern end of the border. Periodically, these disputes have led to armed skirmishes and more serious conflict. Cambodia has referred the border delimitation or alignment dispute related to the Temple of Priya Vihir to the International Court of Justice, ICJ, on 2 occasions, 1962 and 2013, and obtained judgments in its favour, but Thailand has not accepted the court's decisions. The border dispute remains unresolved and Thailand has stationed troops at the temple. Many of the border disputes are complex. In the case of the Temple of Priya Vihir, the original temple on the site, a strategic mountain top on the border, was built by the Khmer Empire in the 9th century, so the ICJ ruled it belonged to Cambodia, but the most direct route of access to it is via the Thai side of the border, which the court also acknowledged. While the disagreements remain extant, there had been an absence of conflict over the past decade. This changed earlier this year when tensions increased in several disputed areas along the border, with a skirmish on the 28th of May in the area of the Chongbok Pass through the Dangrik Mountains in which one Cambodian was killed. Following several more diplomatic and political incidents, one of which led to the suspension of the Thai Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra by the country's constitutional court, the crisis broke out into open-armed conflict on the 24th of July. 4 days of fierce fighting followed before Thailand and Cambodia agreed to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire to come into effect at midnight on the 28th of July local time. The ceasefire was brokered by the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, in his capacity as current chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, in the presence of diplomats from China and the United States. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet and Thailand's acting Prime Minister Phumtham Wechayachai both hailed the outcome, noting that there had been many killed and injured on both sides and that some 300,000 refugees, 140,000 Cambodians and 160,000 Thais, had fled the fighting. Since the ceasefire came into effect, Cambodia-Thailand border talks have continued in Kuala Lumpur, focused on implementing the ceasefire and improving communication between the two armies. Importantly, it has been agreed that an ASEAN observation team led by Malaysia will monitor the ceasefire. As of the 7th of August, the ceasefire is reported to remain fragile and troops continue to build up on both sides of the border. Many refugees deem it is not yet safe to return home. The Congo, the M23 insurgency continues by David Leese. For several months, we have been following the M23 insurgency in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. As background, for the past 30 or so years, there has been an on and off conflict in the Kivu region of the DRC in the country's east. The Kivu region shares a border with Rwanda and Burundi. The conflict involves ethnic tensions between Hutus, supported by Burundi, and Tutsis, supported by Rwanda, conflated with conflicts over mineral wealth, among other things. Tutsis, who were the target of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, are an ethnic minority in the Congo, but have a notable presence in the Kivu region. North Kivu and South Kivu provinces are rich in minerals such as coltan, which is used to make components in smartphones and laptops. It is now a valuable commodity on the global market, and many players have an interest in exploiting such minerals, legally or illegally, not least the Rwandan government of President Paul Kagame. Most recently, the principal opposition to the Congolese government in Kivu has come from the March 23 movement, usually referred to as M23, a Tutsi militia. M23 receives military and other support from the Rwandan government, which uses M23 illegally to exploit Kivu's mineral resources. M23 has become quite professional both militarily and as civil administrators in territory it has seized. M23 also is now part of a larger rebel coalition, the Congo River Alliance, AFC, that opposes the Congolese government in the eastern Congo. On the government side is the Congolese Army, known as FARDC, the military of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The army is assisted by United Nations, UN, and Southern African Development Community peacekeepers. It is also supported by the FDLR, Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, an ethnic Hutu militia, whose members committed the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and other pro-government militias such as the Wasalendo, a pro-government rebel coalition. The current fighting in the Kivu region was initiated by M23 in 2022, when M23 launched a major military offensive which has been ongoing since then at varying levels of intensity and for which the Rwandan government has supplied weapons, ammunition, other material, and troops. Following a lengthy pause, the offensive was resumed in October 2024 and ramped up dramatically in January 2025, when M23 seized large amounts of territory in both Kivu provinces. In a major battle between the 23rd and the 30th of January, M23 captured Goma, the capital of North Kivu, forcing relocation of the provincial government to a temporary capital. There followed a reduction in the fighting initially as M23 consolidated its territorial gains, instituted civil administrations in its new territories, and intensified its mining activities. Nevertheless, authorities say some further 7,000 people had been killed in fighting by June. The DRC government blames Rwanda for the conflict in Kivu. Diplomatic relations between the Congo and Rwanda broke down on the 24th of January, leading the expulsion of Rwandan diplomats from Kinshasa and the recall of DRC diplomats from Rwanda. United Nations sources estimated that between 500 and 1,000 Rwandan troops assisted M23 in the Goma area. On the 27th of January, Congolese and Rwandan troops exchanged fire across their border near Goma. There are fears the Kivu conflict could spread into a wider regional war, given the presence of Rwandan and Burundi troops in the Kivu provinces. Somewhat surprisingly then, in March, Congolese President Félix Tshisekedi and his Rwandan counterpart Paul Kagame met in Doha and reaffirmed their commitment to an unconditional ceasefire. This led to peace talks between the DRC government and the M23 rebels mediated by Qatar. On the 23rd of April, after a week of talks that both sides described as frank and constructive, the DRC government and the M23 rebels agreed to halt the fighting until the peace talks mediated by Qatar reached their conclusion. The peace talks in Doha notwithstanding, local conflicts continued in eastern Congo, with further villages falling to the M23 rebels in April and May. On the 27th of June, Rwanda and the DRC signed a bilateral peace agreement in Washington, followed on the 19th of July by a so-called Doha Declaration between the DRC government and M23 rebel leaders, which committed both sides to a ceasefire and further negotiation. Humanitarian NGOs, however, say little has changed on the ground. There has been a surge in brutal attacks on civilians by armed groups. At least 319 civilians were killed by M23 fighters, aided by members of the Rwanda Defense Force, between the 9th and the 21st of July in North Kivu province. Most of the victims, including at least 48 women and 19 children, were local farmers camping in their fields during the planting season. The growing insecurity is fueling one of the world's most acute humanitarian crises. According to UN figures, over 7.8 million people are now internally displaced in eastern DRC, while 28 million people are facing food insecurity, including nearly 4 million at emergency levels. Adding to the strain, more than 30,000 refugees from South Sudan have fled into the DRC's Ituri province since April, escaping a wave of killings and active hostilities.
This strategic update was produced by the RUSI New South Wales Special Interest Group on Strategy. The SIG Strategy Group seeks to enhance knowledge of strategy, including the evolution of strategic thought, maintain awareness of current geostrategic issues, and undertake research on nominated issues of current strategic interest.